The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and tension. Senior Chief Marcus Webb stood at the front, pointing to a satellite image pinned to the board while his six-man SEAL team sprawled in folding chairs with the casual arrogance of men who had done this 100 times before. "Tonight we insert into the Karengal Valley," Webb said, tapping a circled compound on the image. "Intel suggests high-value target movement through this area. Observe and report only. No direct action unless compromised." Petty Officer Daniels leaned back in his chair. "Babysitting duty," he muttered just loud enough for the others to hear. Chief Morrison smirked. Chin kept his face neutral, but his eyes said enough. Webb was about to continue when the door opened and Colonel Harrison stepped inside, followed by a woman in army fatigues. She was compact, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that came from either boredom or absolute control. Webb could not tell which. "Gentlemen," Harrison said, "this is Master Sergeant Elena Reyes. She will be serving as your joint liaison observer for this operation. She will monitor from Ridge Position Alpha and provide Overwatch reporting." The team exchanged glances. Daniels did not bother hiding his reaction this time. "Great," he said under his breath. "Now we have a tourist." Reyes heard him. Webb saw her eyes flick toward Daniels for half a second before returning to the map on the wall. She said nothing. Now, wherever you are watching this right now, maybe you have been in a room like that. Maybe someone looked right past you because they assumed they already knew what you were capable of. Comment below where you are watching from and tell me if you have ever been underestimated at work. Harrison excused himself, leaving Reyes standing near the door like an afterthought. Webb studied her for a moment. She carried no visible weapon, just a small pack slung over one shoulder. Her uniform bore no flash or insignia that meant anything to him. "Master Sergeant," Webb said, stepping toward her. "What exactly is your role if things go sideways down there?" Reyes met his gaze without hesitation. "I observe and report, Senior Chief. That is my designated function." Morrison snorted from his chair. "Observe and report. Sound about right." Webb waited for her to add something, to defend herself, to assert some qualification that might make her presence less absurd. She offered nothing, just stood there with that unreadable expression, like she was waiting for him to finish so she could get on with her own preparations. He felt his irritation rise, but kept it controlled. "Fine. You will need our frequency for communication." He grabbed a notepad, scribbled a number, and handed it to her. "This is your channel." Reyes looked at the paper. "This is the backup frequency." Webb shrugged. "Primary gets crowded during operations. Backup is cleaner." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The backup channel was where they dumped non-essential traffic, the frequency they checked last and answered least. He was putting her in a box before the mission even started. Reyes folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. "Understood," she said. Chun watched the exchange with something approaching curiosity, but Daniels was already heading for the door, Morrison and Kowalski close behind. The team filtered out of the briefing room, their laughter echoing down the corridor. Someone made a joke about bringing binoculars for the tourist. Webb gathered his notes and headed for the door himself. He paused at the threshold, looking back. Reyes had not moved. She stood at the map, studying the terrain with an intensity that seemed excessive for someone whose job was to watch and take notes. "Wheels up in 2 hours," Webb said. "Do not be late." She did not turn around. "I will be ready, Senior Chief." He left her there, already mentally filing her away as a bureaucratic inconvenience. Another checkbox on someone's joint operations requirement. Another body to account for who would contribute nothing when the shooting started. In the corridor, Daniels fell into step beside him. "Think she has ever heard a shot fired in anger?" Webb shook his head. "Does not matter. She will be a kilometer away on that ridge. Worst case, she calls in what she sees after we have already handled it." Daniels grinned. "Observers. You know what they say about those who cannot do." They walked toward the ready room, already focused on the mission ahead. Behind them, in the empty briefing room, Elena Reyes opened her pack and began checking her equipment. Her fingers moved with practiced precision over components that Daniels would not have recognized, pieces that assembled into something far more dangerous than binoculars. She checked the wind data she had collected during 3 days of pre-mission reconnaissance. She reviewed the range card she had built for every likely engagement point in the valley. She verified the zero on a scope that had tracked targets at distances these SEALs had probably never attempted. Then she closed the pack, shouldered it, and walked out into the Afghan night. 2 hours until insertion. Plenty of time to prepare for a mission everyone assumed she would watch from the sidelines. The helicopter banked hard over the mountain ridge, rotors chopping through thin air that smelled like dust and pine. Elena Reyes sat alone in the cargo bay, watching through the open door as the second bird, carrying Webb's team, descended toward the valley floor below. Their running lights blinked twice, then vanished into the darkness between the peaks. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset. 5 minutes to your drop point, Master Sergeant. You need anything before we set you down? Silence, Reyes said. Just silence. The pilot chuckled, but obliged, and the helicopter climbed toward Ridge Alpha in the quiet that followed. Below, the Karangal Valley spread out like a black scar between the mountains, dotted with sparse clusters of lights from villages that had seen more war than peace. Somewhere down there, 6 SEALs were beginning their infiltration toward a compound they believed held a high-value target. They moved with confidence born from dozens of similar missions, trusting their training and their teammates, and very little else. Reyes understood that confidence. She also understood its limitations. The helicopter flared and touched down on a rocky outcropping 1,400 meters above the valley floor. Reyes was out before the skids fully settled, pack over one shoulder and rifle case in her opposite hand. The crew chief leaned out after her, grinning beneath his flight helmet. Enjoy your camping trip, he shouted over the rotor wash. Try not to get bored up here. She did not respond. The helicopter lifted off and banked away, navigation lights disappearing over the ridge within seconds. Then she was alone with the wind and the stars and the weight of what she had carried up this mountain. Reyes moved to a position she had scouted 3 days earlier, a natural depression in the rock that offered clear sight lines across the entire valley while providing concealment from below. She had marked it on no official map, logged it in no mission report. Some preparations were better kept private. She opened the rifle case and began assembly. The M2010 Enhanced Sniper Rifle came together in her hands with the familiarity of an extension of her own body. Stock locked to receiver, barrel seated and torqued, scope mounted and verified against the reference marks she had recorded during her last session at the range. Every movement was precise, unhurried, the product of 10,000 repetitions until conscious thought was no longer required. The wind indicators she had placed during her reconnaissance were exactly where she had left them. 3 strips of cloth tied to rocks at measured intervals across the ridge, each one telling her something about the air currents that would affect a bullet traveling over 1,000 meters. She checked them now through her scope, noting the angle and intensity of their movement, building a mental model of the invisible forces that separated a hit from a miss at extreme range. Below, the SEAL team emerged from their insertion point and began moving toward the target compound. Reyes tracked them through her optic, watching their formation with a professional eye. Webb on point, Daniels and Morrison flanking, Chun and Kowalski covering rear security, the 6th man whose name she had not caught handling communications. They moved well enough, she supposed, confident in their spacing, aggressive in their pace. Too aggressive. They were making good time, but sacrificing noise discipline to do it. She could hear the faint crunch of their boots on loose rock even from her elevated position, carried upward by the valley's acoustics. If she could hear them, others could too. Movement caught her eye on the eastern ridge. She shifted her scope, adjusting focus, and felt her pulse slow the way it always did when the world narrowed to a single point of attention. For figures moving parallel to the SEALs, using the terrain to mask their approach. She watched them for 30 seconds, tracking their pattern, then swept the ridge line further east. 7 more, then 5 additional behind those. The count climbed as she methodically scanned every shadow and fold in the terrain. 12 fighters, 15, 19, all moving with purpose toward positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire on the valley floor. The SEALs had walked into a trap, and they had no idea it was closing around them. Reyes keyed her radio, the backup frequency Webb had assigned her with such casual contempt. Observer Alpha to Trident Actual. I have eyes on enemy movement, Eastern Ridge. 19 fighters moving to ambush positions along your route. Recommend immediate halt and reassessment. Static answered her. She waited 5 seconds, then transmitted again. Trident Actual, Observer Alpha. Confirming 19 enemy personnel shadowing your position. Please acknowledge. Webb's voice came through, irritation clear even through the distortion. Observer Alpha, this is Trident Actual. Maintain radio silence unless critical. We have the situation under control. Out. Reyes stared at her radio for a long moment. She had given him the information. He had chosen to dismiss it, just as he had dismissed her at the briefing, just as his team had laughed about tourists and babysitters. She could push harder, break protocol, demand he listen. But she had spent enough years in the military to know how that conversation would end. A woman's voice on the radio, telling a SEAL team leader he was wrong. The message would not survive the messenger. Understood, she said finally. Observer Alpha out. She set the radio aside and returned to her scope. The enemy force had grown to 23 now, with more likely concealed in positions she could not see. They were settling into their ambush points with the patience of men who had done this before, who knew these valleys and these mountains and exactly how to kill Americans who wandered into their territory. The SEALs walked on, oblivious, closing the distance to a kill zone that waited for them like an open grave. Reyes checked her ammunition. 47 rounds, match grade, each one hand inspected before she had packed them. She verified her range card one final time, memorizing the distances to key terrain features across the valley. Then she settled into her position, controlled her breathing, and began the slow, patient work of identifying targets. If Webb would not listen to her warning, she would have to deliver a different kind of message. The target compound emerged from the darkness like a crooked tooth, its mud walls catching the faint starlight 800 meters ahead. Webb raised his fist, and the team froze behind him, dropping to knees in the sparse cover of a rocky wash that cut across the valley floor. They had made good time, better than expected, and now they had eyes on the objective. Webb scanned the compound through his night vision. 2 guards visible on the northern wall, a third smoking near the main gate. Vehicles parked in a courtyard suggested recent arrivals. This was the place, and if their intel was accurate, someone worth catching was inside those walls. He signaled Morrison to set up observation while the rest of the team secured their perimeter. Daniels moved left, Chun right, Kowalski and the radio man covering their backtrail. Standard protocol, executed with the smooth efficiency of men who had worked together through a dozen deployments. Webb allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Clean insertion, no contact, perfect positioning. The observer on the ridge had been worried about nothing. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Webb heard the cracks split the air a fraction of a second before Kowalski screamed. He spun in time to see the petty officer crumple, hands clutching his thigh where dark blood was already pulsing between his fingers. Arterial. The word flashed through Webb's mind, even as more gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Contact, he shouted, though the word was swallowed by the chaos. East Ridge, South Ridge, compound. Get to cover. There was no good cover. The rocky wash that had seemed adequate for observation offered nothing against the crossfire, now raking their position. Rounds snapped overhead and kicked dirt into Webb's face as he grabbed Kowalski's vest and dragged him toward a cluster of boulders that might stop a bullet or might not. Morrison was returning fire toward the eastern ridge, his suppressed rifle coughing in controlled bursts. Daniels had found a depression in the ground and was trying to identify targets through the muzzle flashes that strobed across the mountainside. Chun was with Kowalski now, applying a tourniquet with hands that moved fast but steady. Webb counted the enemy positions. For shooters on the east ridge, at least 3 more on the south. Additional fire coming from the compound itself. which meant their target had been expecting company. This was not a chance encounter. This was a prepared ambush, and his team had walked directly into the kill zone. The whistle of an incoming RPG gave him half a second to flatten himself against the rocks. The explosion hammered the air 20 meters to his left, showering the team with debris and stone fragments. Someone cursed. Someone else called out a target bearing. The organized chaos of a SEAL team under fire kicked into gear, but Webb could already feel the mathematics working against them. Overwatch, this is Trident Actual. He barked in his radio on the primary frequency. Troops in contact, grid reference follows. Request immediate air support. The response came through scratchy but clear. Trident Actual, Overwatch. Negative on air support. All rotary and fixed-wing assets committed to troops in contact in Sector 7. Earliest available is 30 minutes. Confirm you can hold. Webb's stomach dropped. 30 minutes. With 24 enemy fighters pouring fire into their position from elevated terrain, with Kowalski bleeding out and ammunition finite, and no cavalry coming. 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. Negative Overwatch, he transmitted. We cannot hold 30 minutes. We need something now. The reply was apologetic but unhelpful. Working the problem, Trident. Hold what you can. Overwatch out. A second RPG streaked across his vision and detonated against the boulder Morrison was using for cover. The chief went down hard, clutching his shoulder where shrapnel had torn through his uniform. Webb saw blood, but Morrison was moving, cursing, dragging himself to a new position with his rifle still in hand. Wounded but functional. For now, Webb did the math again. 6 men, 2 wounded, 1 critically. Enemy force of unknown size, but at least 15 to 20 based on the volume of fire. Surrounded on 3 sides with only the ridge at their back offering any avenue of retreat, and that ridge climbed 1,400 meters to a position held by one woman with binoculars who had tried to warn him about exactly this situation. The backup channel. The frequency he had given her as an insult, a way of putting her in her place, telling her without words that her observations did not matter. He had not checked it since her transmission about enemy movement. The one he had dismissed as overcautious, the one that had been exactly right. Webb pulled his secondary radio from his vest, the one tuned to the frequency he never monitored. His thumb found the transmit button, and he pressed it with hands that had started to shake, though whether from adrenaline or something else he could not say. Observer Alpha, this is Trident Actual. His voice came out strained, barely above a whisper as rounds continued to crack overhead. We are pinned down and taking casualties. Air support is 30 minutes out. He paused, swallowed his pride along with the bile rising in his throat. We need help. Any help you can provide. Static answered him. The gunfire intensified. Morrison called out that he was down to his last magazine. Somewhere behind the rocks, Kowalski had gone quiet in a way that could mean unconsciousness or something worse. Webb pressed the transmit button again. Observer Alpha, please respond. His voice cracked on the last word. He was begging now, begging the woman he had dismissed, begging the tourist his team had mocked. Please, we're dying down here. The static stretched for an eternity that lasted 3 seconds. Then a voice came through, calm and steady as a surgeon beginning an operation. Engaging now. Elena Reyes heard the desperation in Webb's voice and felt nothing but clarity. The panic, the pleading, the crack in his words when he said, please. She registered all of it and set it aside like noise that did not serve her purpose. Emotion was for after. Right now, there was only the scope, the wind, and 25 men who needed to die before they killed the team in the valley below. Engaging now, she said into the radio, and then she stopped talking. Her breathing slowed to a rhythm she had practiced 10,000 times. For seconds in, hold for 2, for seconds out. Her heart rate dropped from 70 beats per minute to 58. The world narrowed to a circle of magnified light, and within that circle, she began to hunt. The eastern ridge held the command element. She had identified them during her earlier observation. 3 fighters clustered near a rock formation with radios pressed to their ears, directing the others with hand signals and shouted commands. They were coordinating the ambush, synchronizing fire from multiple positions, making sure the SEALs had nowhere to run. Take them out, and the enemy would lose their cohesion. The ambush would become a collection of individuals instead of a coordinated kill team. Reyes settled her crosshairs on the leader, a bearded man in a dark jacket who held his radio like a lifeline. The rangefinder showed 1,847 meters, nearly a mile and a quarter. At that distance, the bullet would take almost 3 full seconds to arrive. She would need to account for wind drift, elevation change, the Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation, and a dozen other variables that most shooters never learn to calculate. She made the adjustments without conscious thought. Windage left, elevation up, a fraction of a millimeter that translated to meters of difference at the target. Her finger found the trigger and began the slow, steady pressure that would break the shot without disturbing her aim. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. She rode the recoil, keeping her eye in the scope, watching the vapor trail of the bullet arc across the valley. 2 seconds. 2.5. 3. The commander's head snapped back, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. His radio tumbled from his hand and clattered against the rocks, transmitting nothing but dead air. Reyes was already shifting to the second target. Another coordinator, younger, who had turned toward his fallen leader with confusion on his face. He never finished the turn. Her second shot caught him center mass and spun him off the ridge, his body tumbling down the slope in a cascade of loose stone. The eastern fire faltered. She could see it happening through her scope, the rhythm of the ambush breaking apart as fighters looked to commanders who were no longer there. Some kept shooting. Others hesitated, waiting for orders that would never come. That hesitation was a gift, and Reyes intended to use every second of it. She swept her scope to the southern ridge, where an RPG team was reloading their launcher. 2 men, one feeding the rocket while the other steadied the tube on his shoulder. At 1,200 meters, they were practically close range. She put her crosshairs on the loader first, squeezed, watched him collapse across the unfired weapon. The shooter tried to swing the launcher toward her position, but he had no idea where she was, and his panic made him slow. Her fourth shot dropped him before he could complete the motion. The Southern fighters began scanning the ridges above them. She watched them point and gesture, trying to locate the source of fire that was dismantling their ambush. They looked east, west, toward the compound, anywhere but the position she had chosen specifically because it offered no visible signature. No muzzle flash at this distance. No sound that could be localized over the echo of the valley. Just death arriving from an impossible range, silent and precise. 3 more fighters exposed themselves trying to find her. 3 more shots. 3 more bodies. Reyes paused to assess. 7 confirmed kills. Her count matched the bodies she could see through her scope. Ammunition at 40 rounds remaining. Enemy strength had been 25 at her last observation, possibly more concealed in positions she had not identified. The mathematics were acceptable, but not comfortable. She would need to be efficient. The radio crackled with Webb's voice, strained but steadier than before. Observer Alpha, what is your status? Repeat, what is your status? She keyed the transmit button without taking her eye from the scope. 7 down. 18 remaining. Continue holding position. She released the button before he could respond. There was nothing he could say that would help her now, and the time she spent talking was time she was not shooting. The enemy was starting to adapt, finding better cover, moving in shorter bounds. They were frightened, but not broken. Professional enough to keep fighting even as their comrades fell around them. Reyes respected that. It would not save them. She identified her next target, a fighter who had found cover behind a fallen log and was pouring automatic fire toward the SEALs below. Good position against ground-level threats. Useless against someone shooting from 1,400 meters above. She waited for him to pause his fire, the moment when he would need to change magazines or shift his aim. The pause came. Her rifle spoke. The fighter slumped forward over his weapon and did not move again. 8 down. 13 rounds. 17 enemies remaining, plus however many she had not yet seen. The night was young, and Elena Reyes was just getting started. Webb pressed his back against the boulder and tried to make sense of what was happening. The southern ridge had gone quiet. Not reduced fire, not suppressed fire. Silent. He risked a glance around the edge of his cover and saw two enemy fighters sprawled across the rocks in positions that suggested they had dropped mid-motion, weapons fallen beside bodies that no longer needed them. He had not seen anyone shoot them. His team was pinned down, conserving ammunition, returning fire only when targets presented themselves. No one on his side had engaged the southern position in at least 2 minutes. Yet there they lay, dead from wounds he could not explain. Daniel scrambled toward him through a gap in the rocks, keeping low as sporadic fire cracked overhead. East Ridge is falling apart, he said, breathing hard. I count 5 down over there, and I have no idea who is hitting them. Webb shook his head. He did not have an answer. The mathematics of their situation had shifted in some fundamental way, but he could not identify the variable that had changed. Enemies were dying. His team was not killing them. Something else was. A distant sound reached him through the chaos, a flat crack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Half a second later, a fighter on the eastern ridge pitched backward and tumbled out of sight. Then another crack, another body falling, the sequence repeating with mechanical precision. Chen appeared at his elbow, eyes wide. Someone is shooting them from extreme range, he said. I have seen this before. Army long rifle teams. But that is impossible. There is no one up there except. He trailed off. Webb felt the realization hit them both at the same moment. The observer, the woman on the ridge, the tourist with binoculars who had tried to warn him about enemy movement, who had given him the exact number of fighters shadowing his team, who he had told to maintain radio silence because he assumed she had nothing useful to contribute. Morrison dragged himself closer, shoulder wound seeping through the bandage Chun had applied. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. What is happening out there, Webb? Who is killing these guys? Webb did not answer immediately. He was watching the enemy positions, counting the bodies that had accumulated in the last few minutes. 8 visible on the eastern ridge. From the south, the RPG team that had nearly killed Morrison was silent, both operators down with wounds that looked identical even from this distance. Another crack echoed across the valley. Another fighter dropped. Webb keyed his backup radio with hands that had stopped shaking. Observer Alpha, what is your status? The response came immediately, calm as a weather report. 14 down, 11 remaining. Continue holding. 14 kills. From a ridge over a kilometer away, in darkness, against moving targets who were actively trying to locate and kill her. Webb had trained with the best shooters in the special operations community. He had never heard of anyone racking up numbers like that in a single engagement. Chen was staring at his radio like it had spoken in tongues. Did she just say 14? Webb nodded slowly. The observer, he said. The tourist. She is the one shooting. Morrison let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. The woman we gave the backup channel. Daniels had gone very quiet. Through his scope, he was watching the remaining enemy fighters, tracking their movements as they tried desperately to find cover from a threat they could not see or understand. One of them broke from his position and sprinted toward a cluster of boulders. He made it 3 steps before the distant crack announced his death. Webb watched the man fall and felt something shift in his chest. They had mocked her, dismissed her, given her scraps, and expected nothing. And now she was single-handedly dismantling an ambush that should have killed his entire team. Kowalski groaned from his position behind the rocks. Chun moved to check his tourniquet, keeping low as the remaining enemy fire grew increasingly scattered. The fighters who were still alive had stopped shooting at the SEALs entirely. They were too busy trying to survive whatever phantom was picking them off from an impossible distance. Webb, Daniel said quietly, I owe that woman an apology. You owe her more than that, Webb replied. We all do. Another crack rolled across the valley. 16 down now by Webb's count. The enemy force that had seemed overwhelming 10 minutes ago had been cut by more than half. The survivors were retreating, abandoning their ambush positions in a desperate scramble for safety that would not come. Webb watched them run and understood that the battle was already over. Not because of anything his team had done. Not because of the air support that was still 20 minutes away. Because one woman with a rifle had decided that 6 SEALs were not going to die in this valley tonight. He looked up toward the ridge where she was positioned, invisible in the darkness, and for the first time since the ambush began, he allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this. The backup channel crackled one more time. 17 down. 8 remaining. They're breaking east. I will pursue until they exit my engagement range. Webb pressed the transmit button. Observer Alpha, he said, and then stopped because he did not know what words could possibly be adequate. Finally, he settled on the only thing that mattered. Thank you. A pause. Then her voice again, unchanged, unhurried, utterly professional. Just doing my job, Senior Chief. Reyes saw them coming before they knew where they were going. 6 fighters breaking from the ambush positions on the eastern ridge, moving not toward the valley floor, but toward the base of her mountain. They had figured out the general direction of her fire. Now, they were coming to kill her. She respected the initiative. It was the right tactical decision. A sniper operating from an elevated position could dismantle an entire force if left unchecked. The smart play was to send a hunter team to eliminate the threat at its source. These were not untrained militants. These were professionals who understood the geometry of the battlefield. Understanding would not save them. Reyes did the mathematics in her head. 6 fighters ascending toward her position. 5 more in the valley, still engaging the SEALs, though their fire had grown sporadic and poorly aimed. The hunters were the priority. If they reached her ridge, her advantage disappeared. She could not shoot down into the valley if she was fighting for her life at close range. The lead fighter reached a gully that cut up the mountainside, a natural avenue of approach that offered concealment from most angles. Not from hers. She had mapped every fold in this terrain during her reconnaissance, identified every route an enemy might use, calculated the ranges and wind corrections for each one. The gully was 1,200 meters from her position, practically point blank. She waited until he was fully committed to the climb, both hands on the rocks above him, rifle slung across his back. Then she squeezed the trigger. The shot took him through the chest, and he fell backward, tumbling down the slope he had just ascended. His body came to rest against a boulder, arms splayed, utterly still. The remaining 5 hunters scattered like startled birds. They found cover behind rocks and ridges, pressing themselves into the terrain with the discipline of men who had trained for exactly this situation. Reyes watched them through her scope, tracking their positions, waiting for the next movement. They began bounding toward her in pairs. 2 would hold position and provide cover while 1 advanced, then they would rotate. Textbook infantry tactics, well executed, designed to minimize exposure while closing distance. Against most shooters, it would have worked. They would have reached the ridge in minutes, overwhelmed the sniper position, ended the threat. Reyes was not most shooters. She identified the pattern within the first 2 bounds, watched which fighter moved first, how long he stayed exposed, where he went aground. The 3rd bound would bring one of them to a cluster of rocks 60 meters ahead of his current position. She placed her crosshairs on that cluster and waited. The fighter rose. She fired. He dropped before his second step touched the ground. 4 remaining. They went static, all of them pressing into cover, no longer willing to expose themselves even for a moment. The hunter team had become the hunted, pinned against the mountainside by the same invisible death they had come to eliminate. Reyes let them stay there. They were neutralized as a threat, unable to advance, too frightened to retreat. She could finish them later. Right now the SEALs in the valley needed her attention. She swung her scope back to the ambush positions. 3 fighters had used the distraction of the hunter team to reposition, moving to new cover that gave them better angles on Webb's team. One of them was setting up a belt-fed machine gun that could shred the rocks the SEALs were using for protection. Reyes put her crosshairs on the machine gunner and fired. He slumped over his weapon, fingers still on the trigger, a burst of rounds spraying harmlessly into the night sky as he died. The fighters beside him looked up in horror, searching for a threat they had forgotten about in their focus on the valley below. She shot the second one before he could find cover. The 3rd ran, abandoning his position entirely, sprinting toward the compound with no thought for tactics or discipline. She let him go. One fleeing fighter was not worth the ammunition. He would tell others what had happened here, spread fear, through whatever network had planned this ambush. That had value too. Reyes checker count. 18 confirmed kills. 31 rounds remaining. The hunter team on a mountainside had not moved in 2 minutes. The valley ambush was collapsing, fighters dead or fleeing or cowering in positions that offered no shot at the SEALs below. She keyed her radio. 18 down. Hunter team pinned on eastern slope. Valley positions neutralized. You are clear to move your wounded. Webb's voice came back, stronger than before. Copy, Observer Alpha. Moving now. What about the hunters? Reyes looked at the 4 shapes pressed against the mountainside. They would stay there until dawn if she let them, too terrified to move in any direction. Eventually they would realize she had shifted her attention elsewhere. Eventually they would try to escape. She would be waiting when they did. They are not going anywhere, Senior Chief. Focus on your casualties. I will handle the rest. She settled back into her position, scope sweeping between the pinned hunters and the remaining enemy in the valley. The night was half over. Her work was not yet done, but the hard part was finished. The SEALs would survive. The ambush had failed. And somewhere on that mountainside, for men were learning what it felt like to be prey. The last organized resistance crumbled like sand through fingers. Webb watched through his night vision as the remaining fighters abandoned their positions, running not toward the SEALs, but away from the invisible death that had torn their force apart. They scrambled over rocks and through gullies, discipline forgotten, survival the only priority left in minds that had expected an easy kill and found something else entirely. 2 distant cracks echoed across the valley in quick succession. 2 runners fell mid-stride, their momentum carrying them forward into tumbling heaps that did not rise again. The others ran faster, disappearing into the darkness toward the western passes, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever nightmare had descended upon them. Then silence. The gunfire stopped. The shouts stopped. The only sound were the wind moving through the valley and the ragged breathing of 6 SEALs who had expected to die and had not. Webb rose slowly from behind his boulder, scanning the terrain through his optic. Nothing moved on the eastern ridge. Nothing moved on the south. The compound that had been their original objective sat dark and quiet, its defenders either dead or fled. The ambush that should have ended his team had ended itself instead. Clear, he called out, his voice strange in the sudden quiet. Team, report status. The responses came in one by one. Daniels, unhurt. Chun, unhurt. Morrison, wounded but mobile, the shrapnel in his shoulder a problem for later. The radio man had taken a graze across his ribs that he had not even noticed until the shooting stopped. Kowalski was unconscious but stable, tourniquet holding, pulse weak but present. They had survived, all of them, against an ambush force that had outnumbered them 4-1. With superior positions and the element of surprise, they had survived without a single fatality. Webb did not believe in miracles. He believed in what he could see and touch and verify. Right now, he needed to verify what had happened on this battlefield. Chun, he said, walk the perimeter. Count the bodies. I want to know exactly what we are dealing with here. Chun nodded and moved out, rifle up, stepping carefully through terrain that was littered with the dead. Webb watched him go, then turned his attention to the ridges above. Somewhere up there, 1,400 meters away, a woman he had dismissed as a tourist was probably still watching through her scope. He keyed the backup radio. Observer Alpha, Sitrep. The response came immediately, that same calm voice that had announced engaging now and then proceeded to prove what those words meant. 23 confirmed kills. 2 retreated west beyond my engagement range. Ridge assault team neutralized. You're clear to move. 23. Webb, let the numbers sink in. 23 enemy fighters killed by a single shooter from a distance. Most marksmen could not even imagine engaging targets. He had served with snipers his entire career. He had never heard of anyone approaching numbers like that in a single engagement. Chen's voice crackled over the team frequency. pulling Webb back to the immediate situation. "Senior Chief, you need to see this." Webb made his way across the valley floor, stepping over bodies as he went. The enemy dead lay where they had fallen, scattered across 400 meters of terrain in positions that told the story of the battle. Some had died in their ambush positions, cut down before they understood the threat. Others had fallen while trying to relocate, caught in the open by shots they never saw coming. A few lay near the base of the eastern ridge, the hunter team that had tried to eliminate the sniper and paid for the attempt with their lives. Chen stood near the southern ridge, staring down at two bodies that lay beside a Russian-made RPG launcher. The weapon was loaded, ready to fire, its operators dead before they could send another rocket toward Webb's team. "Look at the wounds," Chen said quietly. "Both of them. Center mass. Identical placement." Webb crouched beside the bodies and examined them. Chen was right. Both shots had struck within inches of the same point, directly through the sternum, the kind of precision that required not just skill, but an almost inhuman consistency. From over a kilometer away, in darkness, against targets who were actively trying to kill her, Daniels appeared at his shoulder, face pale in the starlight. "I found a command element on the east ridge," he said. "3 of them, all headshots. From 1,800 meters, Senior Chief. I ranged it myself." Webb stood slowly. The scope of what had happened was becoming clearer with each body they examined. This was not lucky shooting. This was not even exceptional shooting. This was something beyond his experience, beyond his frame of reference, beyond anything he had thought possible. He looked up toward Ridge Alpha, invisible in the darkness above. The woman up there had tried to warn him, had given him exact numbers, exact positions, exact intelligence that could have prevented this entire disaster. He had told her to maintain radio silence, had given her the frequency reserved for people whose input did not matter. And then, when his arrogance had nearly killed his entire team, she had saved them anyway. Without hesitation, without complaint, without a single word about the way he had treated her. Webb made a decision. "Chun, get Kowalski ready for medevac. Morrison, you are going out with him. Daniels, secure the perimeter until extract arrives." He started walking toward the base of the ridge. "Where are you going?" Daniels called after him. Webb did not slow down. "I'm going to meet our observer," he said. "I think I owe her a conversation. The climb would take time." That was fine. He needed every minute of it to figure out what he was going to say to the woman who had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about capability and assumption and the cost of underestimating the people around him. The climb took 15 minutes and burned through muscles that Webb had pushed past exhaustion hours ago. Chun followed 3 meters behind, both of them picking their way up the ridge through loose rock and scrub brush that offered no easy path. The altitude pressed against Webb's lungs with each step, but he did not slow down. Some conversations could not wait for convenience. He found her near the top, in a depression between 2 boulders that he would have walked past without noticing if she had not already begun breaking down her position. The rifle was disassembled, components laid out on a ground cloth in precise order. Wind indicators that he had not seen during his ascent were being collected and stowed. Range cards covered in handwritten data disappeared into a waterproof pouch. Everything methodical, unhurried, the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Reyes looked up as he approached. Her face was calm, unreadable, slicked with sweat that reflected the starlight. She did not seem surprised to see him. She did not seem anything at all. Webb stopped 3 meters away, chest heaving, searching for words that refused to come. Chun hung back, scanning the terrain out of habit, giving them space for whatever was about to happen. "Master Sergeant," Webb finally managed. He paused, swallowed. The formality felt absurd given what she had just done. "Elena." She tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the shift. Webb gestured at the disassembled rifle, the packed equipment, the position she had occupied for hours while his team walked into a trap below. "How?" he asked. The single word carried everything he could not articulate. "How did you do this? How did you know? How did I miss what you were?" Reyes considered the question for a moment before answering. "I had the angle," she said. "Good position, clear sight lines, favorable wind. The equipment did its job. I did mine." Webb shook his head. That is not what I'm asking. 23 kills from over a kilometer away. In darkness. Against a force that should have overwhelmed us. That is not just angle and equipment. She resumed packing, hands moving with that same mechanical precision. I have been doing this for 12 years, Senior Chief. 8 deployments. 17 confirmed kills before tonight. She looked up at him. 40 now, I suppose. The Army Marksmanship Unit does not accept people who miss. She made a small sound behind Webb, something between a cough and a laugh of disbelief. Webb ignored him, focused entirely on the woman in front of him. At the briefing, he said slowly, "You did not say any of that. You did not tell us who you were, what you could do. Why?" Reyes finished securing her pack before she answered. "You did not ask what I could do. You asked what my role was. I told you the truth. Observer and liaison. That was my designated function. But you knew. You knew we were dismissing you. You knew we thought you were a tourist, a checkbox on some joint operations requirement. You could have corrected us." She stood, shouldering her pack with a smooth motion that spoke of long practice. "Yes," she said simply. "I could have." Webb waited for more. It did not come. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind and the distant sound of helicopter rotors beginning to echo through the valley below. Medevac arriving for Kowalski and Morrison. "Why did you not?" Webb pressed. "Why let us treat you like that when you could have shut us down with a single sentence about your record?" Reyes looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time he saw something shift behind her eyes. Not anger, not resentment, something closer to resignation, the expression of someone who had answered this question before and knew the answer would not satisfy. "Because it would not have mattered," she said. "I have been in rooms like that briefing 100 times. With SEALs, with Rangers, with Marine Recon. I can tell them my record and they hear a woman talking. I can show them my qualification scores and they see a checkbox." She shook her head slightly. "Words do not change minds, Senior Chief. Results do." Webb felt the truth of it settle into his chest like a stone. She was right. If she had stood up in that briefing room and recited her credentials, Daniels would have smirked. Morrison would have made a joke. Webb himself would have nodded politely and still given her the backup channel, still dismissed her warning, still walked his team into an ambush while the most qualified sniper in the valley watched from a ridge above. "I gave you the backup channel," he said quietly. Reyes nodded. "Yes, you did." No accusation in her voice. No anger. Just acknowledgement of a fact, the same way she might note wind speed or target distance. Webb found that worse somehow than if she had raged at him. He had nearly gotten his team killed through arrogance and assumption, and she had saved them anyway without asking for recognition or apology. The helicopter sounds grew louder, rotors beating the air somewhere below them. Extract was close. Soon they would be back at base, debriefing, filing reports, moving on to the next mission. But something had changed in this valley that paperwork would not capture. Webb straightened, squaring his shoulders. "When we get back to base," he said, "we need to talk more. About tonight. About what happens next." Reyes studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "All right, Senior Chief." She started down the ridge, moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who had navigated worse terrain in worse conditions. Webb watched her go for a moment. This woman who had killed 23 men to save a team that had mocked her, who had done her job without complaint or expectation of gratitude. Then he followed, because following her lead seemed like the smartest decision he had made all night. Colonel Harrison stood in the operations center at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, watching data scroll across 3 monitors while his coffee grew cold in his hand. The night had been quiet until 20 minutes ago. Now, his communications officer was fielding transmissions that made no sense, and Harrison needed them to start making sense very quickly. "Run that by me again," he said, setting down the cup. "Trident team was ambushed." "Yes, sir," the comms officer replied. "Enemy force of approximately 25 fighters. Coordinated attack from multiple positions. 2 friendly wounded, both stable, en route to base now." Harrison processed the numbers. 25 attackers against a 6-man SEAL team. Ambush conditions, which meant the enemy had chosen the ground, the timing, the angles. 2 wounded on the friendly side was bad, but survivable. What he could not understand was why it was not worse. Casualties on the enemy side, he asked. The comms officer hesitated, checking his notes as if he did not trust what he had written. 23 confirmed killed, sir. 2 escaped to the west. Harrison blinked. Say again. 20 enemy Gia. Confirmed by Trident Actual on the ground. Single shooter from elevated position. That stopped Harrison cold. A single shooter had killed 23 fighters during an active ambush. From an elevated position, which meant the ridge. Which meant the observation post he had assigned to the Army liaison he had attached to Webb's team. He crossed the operations center in 4 strides, pulling up personnel files on the nearest terminal. His fingers found the name, and the record unfolded across the screen in neat rows of data that suddenly seemed inadequate to describe what had happened in that valley. Master Sergeant Elena Reyes. Army Marksmanship Unit, 12 years service. 8 deployments across 3 theaters. 17 confirmed kills prior to this evening. Longest recorded shot at 2,100 meters during her second tour in Iraq. Qualification scores that placed her in the top fraction of a % of military marksmen worldwide. Harrison stared at the file. He had assigned her to Webb's team as a liaison observer, a joint operations requirement that looked good on paper and usually amounted to nothing in practice. He had not reviewed her qualifications beyond confirming she was rated for the position. He had not asked what she was capable of. He had simply handed her to Webb and moved on to more pressing matters. That oversight had apparently resulted in the most lopsided engagement his command had seen in 3 years. The sound of rotors announced the arriving helicopters, medevac birds settling onto the pad outside with the wounded and the rest of the team. Harrison watched through the window as stretchers emerged carrying Kowalski and Morrison, medical personnel swarming around them with practiced efficiency. The others climbed out under their own power, exhaustion visible in every movement. Webb separated from the group and headed directly toward the operations center. Harrison noted the purposeful stride, the set of his jaw. The senior chief had something to say, and Harrison suspected he already knew what it was. The door opened and Webb entered, still in his combat gear, dust and sweat coating every surface. He stopped in front of Harrison and stood at something approaching attention. "Colonel," he said, "I need to debrief you privately." Harrison gestured toward his office. Webb followed, closing the door behind them. The story came out in clipped sentences. The briefing where Webb had dismissed Reyes as a bureaucratic inconvenience. The backup channel he had given her as a deliberate slight. Her warning about enemy movement that he had told her to keep to herself. The ambush that had nearly killed his entire team, and the woman on the ridge who had prevented it while Webb begged for help on the frequency he had assigned her out of contempt. Webb did not make excuses, did not soften the edges. He laid out his failures with the precision of a man who understood exactly how badly he had miscalculated and was prepared to accept whatever consequences followed. Harrison listened without interruption. When Webb finished, the silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. "Where is Master Sergeant Reyes now?" Harrison finally asked. "Armory, sir." Cleaning her weapon. Harrison nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. 23 kills in a single engagement, from a position we designated as observation only, using equipment she brought herself, based on reconnaissance she conducted without orders. Webb said nothing. There was nothing to say. Harrison reached for his phone and dialed the armory. The conversation was brief. When he hung up, he looked at Webb with eyes that had gone hard. "Debrief room," he said. 20 minutes. You, me, and Master Sergeant Reyes. We're going to document exactly what happened tonight, and then we're going to have a very serious conversation about how my command treats the personnel assigned to it. Webb nodded. "Understood, sir." He turned to leave, but Harrison's voice stopped him at the door. "Senior Chief, that woman saved your entire team tonight, after you gave her every reason not to bother." Harrison paused. "I want you to think about that while we wait." Webb did not turn around. "I have not stopped thinking about it, sir." He left. Harrison remained at his desk, staring at the personnel file still glowing on his screen. 40 confirmed kills now. If the reports were accurate, the number would make her one of the most lethal snipers in modern military history. And she had been assigned to watch through binoculars while better men did the real work. Harrison closed the file and stood. There were mistakes to address, records to correct, and a soldier who deserved recognition she had never asked for. The paperwork would take weeks. The conversations would be difficult, but some things could not wait for convenient timing. He headed for the debrief room, already composing the report that would change how everyone at this base understood what had happened in the Karenga Valley. The debrief room smelled like stale air and institutional cleaner. A single table dominated the center, 3 chairs arranged around it, a recording device placed precisely in the middle with its red light already blinking. Colonel Harrison sat at the head. Webb occupied the chair to his left, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed on some middle distance that offered no answers. The door opened and Elena Reyes entered. Her uniform was dusty but squared away, bearing straight, face composed in that same unreadable expression she had worn since the briefing room 12 hours earlier. She had cleaned her weapon, stowed her gear, and arrived exactly on time. If the events of the night had affected her in any visible way, she gave no sign of it. "Have a seat," Master Sergeant Harrison said. "This debrief is being recorded for official documentation. Please state your name and rank for the record." Reyes sat. Master Sergeant Elena Reyes, United States Army, currently attached to Joint Task Force Sentinel as liaison observer. Harrison nodded. "Walk me through the engagement from your perspective. Start from insertion." What followed was the most clinically precise after-action report Webb had ever witnessed. Reyes described her helicopter insertion to Ridge Alpha, her assembly of equipment, her observation of the SEAL team's movement into the valley. Her voice never wavered, never hurried, never betrayed any emotion beyond professional detachment. At approximately 01:30 hours, she continued, "I observed enemy movement on the eastern ridge. Initial count of 4 fighters, increasing to 19 over the following 6 minutes. They were moving parallel to Trident Team's route, establishing positions consistent with a prepared ambush." Harrison leaned forward. "Did you report this observation?" "Yes, sir. I transmitted on the backup frequency I had been assigned. I provided enemy count and recommended immediate halt for reassessment." Webb felt Harrison's gaze shift toward him without turning his head. The weight of it pressed against his temple like a physical force. "What was the response to your transmission?" Harrison asked, his voice carefully neutral. Reyes looked at Webb for the first time since entering the room. Her expression did not change. "I was instructed to maintain radio silence unless the situation was critical. I assessed the situation as critical, but was uncertain whether my assessment would be valued given prior interactions." The words hung in the air. Webb forced himself to meet her eyes, to acknowledge what she was saying without flinching from it. Harrison turned to him directly. "Senior Chief Webb, did you instruct Observer Alpha to limit her communications?" "Yes, sir." Webb's voice came out steady, though it cost him. "I gave her the backup frequency and told her to maintain radio silence. I did not take her warning seriously." "Why not?" The question deserved an honest answer. "Because I assumed she had nothing useful to contribute, sir." "I was wrong." Harrison held his gaze for a long moment, then turned back to Reyes. "Continue, Master Sergeant. What happened after your warning was dismissed?" Reyes resumed her account. The ambush initiation. Webb's distress call on the backup channel. Her decision to engage. She described each shot with the same precision she had used to take them, providing ranges, wind corrections, target descriptions, and outcomes. First target at 1,847 meters, command element leader, single round center mass. Second target at 1,852 meters, secondary commander, single round center mass. The recitation continued through all 23 kills, a catalog of death delivered in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. Webb listened and felt something shift in his understanding. He had known she was skilled. He had seen the bodies, examined the wounds, calculated the distances. But hearing her describe the engagement in her own words made it real in a way the physical evidence had not. She had not been lucky. She had not been desperate. She had systematically dismantled an ambush force with the calm efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor, and she had done it while his team cowered behind rocks and begged for help. Harrison stopped the recording when she finished. The red light blinked off, and something in the room's atmosphere shifted from official to personal. "Master Sergeant Reyes," he said slowly, "based on tonight's events, I am relieving you of your observation duties effective immediately." Webb's head snapped up. "Sir, that is not." Harrison raised a hand, cutting him off. He kept his eyes on Reyes, who had not reacted at all to the announcement. "I am relieving you of observation duties," Harrison continued, "because I am assigning you to direct action advisory for the remainder of your attachment to this task force." He paused. "These SEALs need to see how an Army sniper operates. I expect you to show them." Reyes blinked once. It was the closest thing to surprise Webb had seen from her all night. "Understood, sir," she said after a moment. Harrison stood, signaling the debrief's end. "Senior Chief Webb will coordinate your integration with his team." He looked at Webb with an expression that promised further conversations. "I trust there will be no issues with that arrangement." "No, sir," Webb said. "No issues at all." Reyes stood as well, gathering herself with that same controlled economy of movement. Before she reached the door, Harrison spoke again. "Master Sergeant, for the record, 40 confirmed kills in a single deployment makes you one of the most effective snipers in the history of this command." He paused. "I will be recommending you for appropriate recognition. You have earned it." Reyes turned back, her expression unchanged. "Thank you, sir, but I was just doing my job." She left. Webb watched her go, then turned to Harrison. The colonel's face had hardened again. "Fix this, Senior Chief. Whatever assumptions your team carried into that valley, I want them gone by the time you deploy again. That woman saved 6 lives tonight. Make sure everyone under your command understands exactly what that means." Webb nodded. "Yes, sir." He left the debrief room and headed toward the team quarters. He had work to do, attitudes to change, and a debt to repay that no amount of recognition would ever fully cover. But it was a start. The team quarters were quiet in a way that felt wrong. Daniels lay on his rack staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster that formed patterns his mind kept trying to interpret as something meaningful. 3 racks down, Morrison slept with his shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages, sedatives pulling him under despite whatever dreams might be waiting. Kowalski was in the medical bay, legs saved but career uncertain, unconscious and unaware of the debt he owed to a woman none of them had bothered to respect. Daniels could not stop replaying the briefing. The moment the door had opened and Reyes walked in behind Colonel Harrison, the way he had leaned back in his chair and muttered about babysitters, loud enough for everyone to hear, quiet enough to pretend he had not meant it. The smirk on Morrison's face, the silence from Reyes, who had heard everything and responded to nothing. He had thought her silence meant weakness, thought it confirmed what he already believed about observers and liaisons and women who got attached to SEAL teams as checkboxes on joint operations paperwork. He had been so certain of his own judgment that he never considered the possibility he was wrong. 23 bodies in that valley said otherwise. The door opened and Chun entered, moving quietly out of habit, even though the only person sleeping was too drugged awake. He sat heavily on his own rack, running both hands through hair still matted with dust and sweat. Neither of them had showered. Neither of them had the energy. "I walked the perimeter before extract," Chun said without preamble. "Counted every body, examined the wounds." Daniels turned his head, but said nothing. Chin's voice dropped, something close to bleeding through the exhaustion. "Every shot was center mass or head. Every single one. I looked for misses, for grazes, for anything that suggested she had wasted a round. Nothing. 23 targets, 23 kills. From ranges I would not attempt on a static target in daylight with perfect conditions." Daniels closed his eyes. The math was simple enough. Their team had 6 shooters, all of them trained to standards that exceeded 99% of military personnel worldwide. Combined, they had killed 0 enemy fighters during the ambush. The woman they had called a tourist had killed 23. "You ever seen shooting like that?" Daniels asked. "Once," Chen replied. "Before I went through the pipeline, when I was still Army. They brought the marksmanship unit to Fort Benning for an exhibition. Best shooters in the service, competing against each other for bragging rights." He paused. "Same unit Reyes came from. Same level of precision. These are the people who train Olympic shooters, who develop doctrine for everyone else." We laughed at someone who learned to shoot from the best in the world. The door opened again, and Webb entered. His face looked older than it had 12 hours ago, lines carved deeper around eyes that had seen too much and understood too little until it was almost too late. He looked at his 2 unwounded men and seemed to weigh something before speaking. "Master Sergeant Reyes has been reassigned," he said, "effective immediately. She is attached to our team in a direct action advisory role. She will be deploying with us for the remainder of this rotation." Chen nodded slowly. Daniels sat up on his rack, searching for words that kept slipping away. "Senior Chief," he started, then stopped. "How do we? After what we—" Webb cut him off, but not unkindly. "Yeah, the tourist outshot our entire team combined, exposed every assumption we carried into that valley, saved all 6 of our lives while we hid behind rocks and waited for air support that was never going to arrive in time." He moved his own rack and sat down, the springs groaning under his weight. "Now she's going to teach us," Webb said, "and we're going to learn. Every technique, every calculation, every piece of knowledge she is willing to share. Because the next time we walk into something like that, I want us to be half as prepared as she was." Daniel stared at his hands. They were the same hands that had gestured dismissively during the briefing, that had held a rifle which killed no one while Reyes killed 23. The same hands that would need to shake hers at some point and acknowledge what she had done without the awkwardness choking whatever words he tried to offer. "What were we supposed to say to her?" he asked quietly. "After everything, the comments, the backup channel, telling her to stay quiet. How do we look her in the eye?" Webb was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with rank or authority. "We say thank you," he said. "We say we were wrong. And then we prove it meant something by being better than we were." He looked at both of them. "She gave us a second chance. Do not waste it by dying stupid on the next mission, because we were too proud to learn from someone who knows more than we do." Chen nodded. Daniels felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but permission to move forward instead of drowning in the shame of what he had done. "When do we start?" Daniels asked. Webb checked his watch. "Briefing at 0800. Range time after that. She has agreed to walk us through her methodology." He paused. "Be there early, and be ready to listen this time." He lay back on his rack and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into the rhythm of someone who had learned to sleep whenever opportunity allowed. Daniels lay back as well, but sleep would not come. He kept seeing her face in the briefing room, the moment she had heard his comment and chosen to say nothing. She had known then what they were. She had saved them anyway. That kind of grace was not something he had earned. But maybe if he worked hard enough and listened well enough, he could become someone who deserved it. The ceiling offered no answers, but for the first time since the ambush, Daniels thought he might know where to find them. 3 weeks changed everything and nothing. The FOB looked the same, smelled the same, operated with the same rhythm of briefings and patrols and meals eaten standing up between missions. But something fundamental had shifted in the spaces between, in the way certain people moved through certain rooms, in the weight that certain names now carried. The briefing room held the same folding chairs, the same stained coffee maker, the same maps pinned to walls that had seen 100 operations planned and executed. Webb stood at the front, pointing to satellite imagery of a compound 60 kilometers east of their last engagement. His team filled the seats before him. 6 men who had walked into a valley expecting to die and walked out carrying lessons they would spend careers trying to apply. And at the table, not standing by the wall, not hovering near the door like an afterthought, sat Elena Reyes. Primary objective is reconnaissance and confirmation, Webb said, tapping the image. Intel suggests weapons cache, possibly IED manufacturing. We insert at 0200, establish observation, and report findings. He turned to Reyes. Master Sergeant, sniper analysis. Reyes stood and moved to the map with the ease of someone who belonged there. She pointed to 3 positions marked in red, each one offering different angles on the target compound. Ridge positions here, and here provide overlapping fields of fire, she said. Primary position at 1,400 meters gives clear sight lines to the northern and eastern approaches. Secondary at 1,100 covers the southern road. Tertiary is closer, 800 meters, but offers the best angle on the interior courtyard if we need precision work inside the walls. She pulled out range cards she had prepared, handing copies to each team member. Wind patterns favor early morning insertion. Thermal conditions will be optimal between 0300 and 0500. After dawn, heat shimmer from the valley floor will degrade accuracy at extreme range. Daniel studied his range card with an attention he would not have bothered to fake 3 weeks ago. The data was dense, detailed, the product of calculations he was only beginning to understand. He had spent 6 hours on the range with Reyes the previous week, learning to read wind indicators and adjust for temperature and humidity. 6 hours that had taught him more about precision shooting than 6 years of standard training. Questions, Webb asked. Chun raised his hand. If we take contact, what is our fallback protocol for coordination with Overwatch? Reyes answered without hesitation. Primary frequency for all tactical communications. She glanced at Webb, the faintest flicker of something passing between them. No backup channels. Everyone stays on the same net. Everyone hears everything. If I see a threat developing, you will know about it the moment I do. Webb nodded. That is how we operate now. No compartmentalization, no assumptions about who has useful information. We function as a single unit or we do not function at all. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering extraction protocols, contingency plans, and medical evacuation procedures. When it concluded, the team filed out to prepare their gear. Kowalski lingered, his leg healed enough for light duty, but not yet cleared for field operations. He caught Reyes before she reached the door. Master Sergeant, he said. Got a minute. Reyes turned, waiting. Kowalski shifted his weight, favoring the leg that still ached when the weather changed. I never thanked you properly. For the valley. The medics said another 10 minutes without pressure on that artery, and I would have bled out. You bought us those 10 minutes. Reyes studied him with that calm, measuring gaze. You do not owe me anything, petty officer. Kowalski shook his head. I am walking because of you. Going home to my kids because of you. That is not nothing, Master Sergeant. That is everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then, so softly Kowalski almost missed it, she said, You are welcome. He nodded and limped out, leaving her alone in the briefing room with Webb, who had not moved from his position at the front. The silence between them was comfortable now, stripped of the tension that had defined their first meeting. 3 weeks of shared meals and range sessions and late-night conversations about trajectory and windage had built something that neither of them had expected. Not friendship exactly, but respect, understanding, the recognition of competence that transcended service branches and gender and every assumption Webb had carried into that first briefing. I submitted the paperwork yesterday, Webb said. Silver Star recommendation. Colonel Harrison endorsed it. Should go through without issues given the documentation. Reyes shook her head slightly. The paperwork is not necessary. Webb pushed out from the table and walked toward her. It is not about the paperwork, he said. It is about the record. About making sure what you did gets documented in a way that cannot be ignored or forgotten or explained away as an anomaly. He stopped an arm's length from her, close enough to see the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting through optics in harsh sunlight. I spent 20 years thinking I knew what capability looked like, he said, thinking I could read a person's value in the first 5 minutes of meeting them. You taught me different. That lesson is worth more than any medal I could recommend. Reyes looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that he had not seen before. Not warmth exactly, but an easing of the guard she kept perpetually raised. You listened when it mattered, she said finally. Most do not. When the shooting started, you swallowed your pride and called for help on the channel you gave me as an insult. That took something. Webb grimaced. It took watching my team die. Almost. Almost, she agreed. But they did not. And now you're doing the work to make sure it does not happen again. That matters more than the mistake that came before. She shouldered her pack and headed for the door. At the threshold, she paused, looking back. 0200 insertion, she said. I will be in position an hour before that, running final calculations. If you want, I can walk you through the process. Webb felt something settle in his chest. A knot he had not known he was carrying finally loosening. I would like that, he said. She nodded once and left. Webb stood alone in the briefing room, looking at the map that showed tomorrow's objective and all the ways it could go wrong. Then he gathered his notes and followed her out. There was still time to learn. There is always time to learn, if you were willing to admit you did not know everything. 3 weeks ago, he would have laughed at the idea of an army liaison teaching him anything about his job. Now he understood that the best teachers were often the ones he never thought to ask. The Afghan sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Somewhere out there, enemies were planning and plotting and preparing for the next engagement. They did not know that the team coming for them had changed, that the woman they would never see had already calculated the wind patterns and the ranges and the angles that would define their final moments. Webb walked toward the range where Reyes was waiting, ready to show him things he had spent a career thinking he already knew. So wherever you're watching this right now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever seen someone prove every single doubter wrong? Not with words, but with results that could not be argued with or explained away. Have you ever been that person or known someone who was? Comment below and tell me about a time when capability exceeded expectation, when the person everyone dismissed turned out to be the one who saved the day. And if you're still being underestimated, still waiting for your moment to prove what you are capable of, remember this. The people who doubt you are not the ones who get to define you. Your results will speak for themselves. They always do.